So, thank you for this charming introduction. Thank you for this invitation to come here and to present our work. I've been asked to speak about our work, but also about what we do in teaching. And of course, this relates to each other. And in a way, it's a dual relation. What we find out in practice, we carry back and try to distillate it back into a kind of a teaching strategy. And I'm trying to maybe elaborate on this in the next minutes. I start with an image. It's an image that I found always very fascinating. It's Houdini, of course. And he invented, in a way, an art that you can say it's an art of deliberation. You know, you put yourself some chains on and you've been thrown overboard several times and you somehow survive. And Houdini actually had a very natural death, you know, so he didn't drown. As a metaphor, I found him as a person very interesting, because when you study architecture, and then when you also teach architecture, and at one point when you also start to practice architecture, you see the different facets and the different gradations of pressure or of security or of liberty, but also of constraint. And maybe I'm a generation of architects in Switzerland that operates in a different field than its current image of Swiss architecture, because let's say my teachers were still very, very able to rely on a system that would not interfere into an art authorship, for example. And today we have a very aggressive market economy, and we have a lot of constraints or issues that go against the discipline of architecture. And how can we survive, and how can we think about that? It's one of the kind of key operations of maybe also my generation. There's another image which I found very fascinating, which is a still from a movie, Fountainhead. And it's exactly a very special moment in the movie where the client and also academia is kind of insisting against modern architecture and said, like, we want you to adapt your building like this. And it is basically a kind of a scene of sabotage, you can say, or it is an interference of the client that shows how much power the client has and how vulnerable architecture is. And I find even the quality of the image very, very interesting, because it has this kind of quality of collage. It's almost a kind of a post-modern intervention, so to speak. And for us, this we found very interesting. How two fundamental different things collide with each other, and how do you deal with this? And then an image I think that works really well with our place here. It's Hugh Ferris, his fantastic maximum mass studies about the New York law. Zoning law, stage 2. And what I found always fascinating is the way he sort of describes in this perspective the different conditions of exploiting the maximum envelope, so to speak, of a lot, and even the inclined conditions, the setbacks. It's obvious that he finds a way how to fuse different volumetric conditions into one system. And this exactly targets what my brother and me are actually working on. And three statements to what we are really dealing and what we are aiming for. A strategic architecture mixes elements, value systems, and action logics. It opens up a combination of essential priorities The target of strategic architecture is to manage the coexistence of conflicting values. That's very important for us. So to deal with regimes or to deal with conditions that are not agreeing or that do not agree to the same ambition. The combination of multiple architectural conditions within a single system inherently challenge the conventional view of building identity and our notion of understanding of autonomous types. It's clear, if you fuse two things together, it's neither the one that was previous nor the other, but what is it actually? It could be seen as a tool to elaborate a specific combination of program, structure, or typologies in order to deal and systemize discrepancies, mixing, assembling, arranging, and composing diverse identities in order to obtain a new singularity in which parts are recognizable but no longer restorable. So this is what we are kind of mutually interested in our architecture, and this is a fantastic example that we also use in our classes. It's a work by the Croatian artist Jusovic that fuses basically the pipe and the shoe, and just the discovery of a absolute similarity in cross-section that fits them together, of course, fuses these two conditions, and due to the fact that it's art and not architecture, there is no obligation of a new singularity or a new functionality, so to speak, but of course it reads it newly as a metaphor between a female condition and a male condition, between a female elegance and a male habit, so to speak. So this kind of moment where things become no longer separable, but actually a new dimension is a very interesting way how to a potential given, and this is like a hypothesis now, but we will see later, how to a potential given brief that has paradoxes or that works with discrepancies, you can find an artistic answer to it to fuse and to bring together. Let's say our students were not so sophisticated with the meeting of the object, but what was really interesting is like there were two fundamental different objects, like a glass where you would store marmalade or a shower head. But the fusion, the combination of it actually mobilizes, so to speak, a shower, or becomes a kind of literal hand shower. So it's a kind of a simulation of a new functionality that we find very inspiring as a procedure, as a concept to actually explore. And of course it can be also shown with let's say with more an architectural language where a slab or a number of slabs fuses to a kind of very compressed idea of a tower. So these elements resemble a kind of a groundwork which we do with our students in Mendrisio at the Academia. And in a very early state of our office, my brother and me, we started to speculate and to configure different configurations to experiment with the phenomena to scale up a project. And we used the Mies architecture for it in order to eliminate the burden to express immediately an architectural making to your speculation. So the Miesian architecture for us was also a kind of a liberation, so that we were more interested in how things could be composed or added or put in relation to. And that was what was very interesting for us. Was in 2006 we made our first international competition, and we elaborated further on this strategy, and we proposed the building in Berlin that was basically a montage of the Seagram building, which you obviously see, which stands for a very compact, a very economic, a very repetitive system of space, and montaged or juxtaposed the Farnsworth house in it, which is a unique house, it's a lush house, it's a very elegant house. So two fundamental different pieces of architecture, two fundamental different pieces of typologies. We mixed them or confronted the two things. And of course, we had an idea that what is repetitive would be an office and what is unique is a conference center. It was the new headquarters of the Heinrich Böll Foundation. And we translated this very quick development of the montage into a strategy of a model, which we call the white model, which is a kind of an abstract expression of exactly this form of this intervention. So to have a kind of very much a repeated, homogeneous main volume, which then becomes interfered by another one. And the model unifies the two interventions, and therefore it was a kind of a very good way to develop a montage and then to go further and build basically a model from this strategy. And since the brief of this competition was so controversial because the client had a huge ambition but absolutely no budget, and this kind of complete disalignment of it, the idea, of course, was to develop an architecture where we could save a lot of money and then also to have an architecture where we could actually spend it. And this is exactly the same model, but this is the strategy if you look at how costs are evolved. So you see that the red line, the horizontal line, this is always the line that all the architects fear because this is your standard cost horizon. This is the total average. Everything needs to be in there, or below, of course. And then what we introduced a system with red dots or with elements that we thought it was very interesting, very important to have. So these were the very expensive ones, but they occurred exactly once in the building. And the green one were the very cheap ones that had a very repetitive, high degree of repetition in it. And this was a kind of a cross calculation. And this model is basically the same model. This is just an architectural language, and this is just a mathematical language. Here, exactly here, in this area, everything occurs only once, and in the rest, there's always a high repetition. So you have a kind of a strategy to be very careful, to very defined, and on the other hand, you develop an area where you can loosen some of the aspects or the definitions you had. And the building got built. It was a success for us. It was in 2008, just 2 years later, inaugurated, and it works well. There's a book, if you're interested in it. This is a book that was published by Park Book, and it's the German title is called Leise Formen. The English title is Silent Form, and it's a catalog, and a catalog of exactly these kind of interventions or these configurations that always have a strategic story to it. And it gives the strategy, so to speak, a form. And it was all documented by the American native photographer and artist John Neyman, which is a good friend of us that follows our work of more than 15 years now. There's a whole inventory about how a story can be linked, or how a discovery or a paradox can be linked to the aspiration of form. And it goes deep into the architectural debate. It is basically a very open system, but it still is linked to a kind of methodology that I'm just explained. So it hits the structural idea of architecture, and it hits the skin or the tectonics or the surfaces of the same architecture. or it has a kind of a quality of a silhouette or a section or an inner organization. And it works basically always with the kind of mode of discovery. And for us, this is a kind of a frame in which we are trying to establish our architecture. It's like our tools that allow us to discover, instead of that we have to do tools and discovery, which is always too much for us, you know. And this is a link to the university. This is the place where I teach. And this is a day before the final review. And a tradition of the house is that the dean opens the entire school for model building. Because the school is so tight and we have a lot of students that not every student would have the possibility to build their own model, not even the way that the professor would request it. So they opened the entire area, the entire auditorium, everywhere they build models. And I found this now in the context of what we are interested in the way we could enhance this ability of linking basically a research and a phenomena of fusing things through image, model, and plan. This was a fantastic beginning. And this is just 6 hours later. You see, it's the same space. This was the dark space, and this, of course, the bright, the day. This is the review, and in this review, you see how we trying to give ourselves a guideline. We have 4 basic elements which we deal with our students. We have the question of integration. What are we doing with the context of the urban context, the city in which we are working, and what ambition or what discovery is leaving that contextual aspect beyond, which, or you can say, what is delivering more than the evident, which then becomes a kind of an architectural concept represented into a kind of a strategic model, this white model which you have seen. And it uses the montage to shift the strategic aspect of architecture into a sensual experience. And then in the end, we have a plan left. And the plan is basically the organization of space. So it's a very strict order, you can say, with techniques, but what we discover is very open. So we can really employ this within our discourse at the school. And I don't have the time now, of course, to do all the students' project or to explain a few of them, but you see maybe through the sequences of images that I'm going to show the way they deal or the way they try to control this architecture that they have discovered. This was a project in Berlin dealing basically with the idea of a block, but introducing into the block a large operation or a large plan, a large public hall, which normally would be separate. So block is housing and the hall would be an object. So this fusing aspect, and you will see from the central void an exception, so a model that then starts to examine exactly these operations, these moments where small scales branches into a type of block structure and a large scale is embedded. And the scenography or the sensuality of the collage that uses the fore, the middle, and the background basically to develop in scenery of public spaces, of borders, of membranes, of passages that operates exactly in this idea, and concluding in a plan, in one plan that exactly negotiates this calibration between housing or courts or familiar scale to the context and expanding the notions, including a passage or a large space for 10,000 people. It's just an example how, let's say, the frame, the sort of the delivery is always the same, but of course the discoveries should be always different. This is our school, and also the way we start to array basically these developments of models. Sometimes a very small model can link to a very great result, or maybe sometimes another one get dismissed, which is a normal process in a design school. So a few other examples. So this fusion idea, this question, how can different scales operate together, or how can a market hall be combined with a high-rise, or a very simple question, which is a very complicated, or that has a very big complication in exactly this search to bring together, to connect, to find solutions. Individual towers that fuse into a kind of idea of common base. How is the structure really logically explored to enhance this idea, or to interfere in existing structures so intelligently that the whole structure is not redundant, but get basically the possibility of an added value. So this is like enlarging the shed in this side, is enlarging the span, is increasing the structural height. So you can take out a number of columns. It's a very basic action, but it produces a very interesting consequence on the program or on usage. So you see, what we do basically in academia is we do like a ground research on those subjects, how things come together. And basically you could say it's almost the same, but of course it's not the same. Some other examples, the differentiation of circulation and structure and hall. How can a building be integrated? You see also the technique to introduce the model, to try to fuse, to try to find an adequacy in expression. It's maybe a bit of a didactic approach, but we think this helps us a lot in controlling of what really is necessary, or what can really be a strong discovery, or the work in silhouettes that the student in this case has evolved with two different types of spaces, two different types of protagonists, like individual galleries and the common space that actually results through the filter of those galleries, and to transcend this into an idea of common structure, how does that fit together, and so forth. So now I make a cut basically, and I'm going to show a sequence of projects that my brother and me have done recently, or are also on the drawing table. And the more the projects are on the drawing table, the better it's also comparable with, of course, the task we follow in the academia. This is Zurich. Zurich is a small town, 450,000 inhabitants. This was a project in the west part. A client that is a diaconry, servicing more than 150 years in healthcare in Zurich, and they wanted to build a new headquarter in a very robust, or you can say in a very industrial area. This was the first shot, the impressions. This is some side images. You see how it's quite untypical for Zurich, because Zurich normally, those of you that know Central Europe a bit, Zurich is completely polished. I mean, there's no dirty corner, so to speak. It was for us a big surprise that in this area they wanted to develop a new headquarter. And then this. A very complicated program, very complicated. So basically it was a diaconry that had its own administration. It was a healthcare clinic. It was a palliative clinic. It was a daycare with more than 85 kids. It was a business hotel. It was a conference center. It was offices, large kitchens, restaurants for employees, and a public restaurant. So you can say at one point, what else? What else? And the interesting fact is that you lose a kind of the relevance of your program when it becomes a tendency to be developed as a mixed program. And the question for us that became very relevant is, what kind of architecture do you propose if you have no hold on a program? When your architecture is completely independent from the program, because you could also add a hairdresser or you could add something else in there. And we proposed a very rigid architectural grid, a kind of a load-bearing concept of a facade with eccentric cores. And you see this from the other side. You see how eccentric the core is, allowing two different spans to be established in this architecture. And it was a very thin slab, 15 meters wide, 40 high, 85 long. And this was the project. It was a facade, very carefully made facade, and then these eccentric cores in apparent concrete. And this was basically the first commission that we had to fulfill. And we developed this project, so this was then built. It's like basically the shell of this entire project. And every piece was precast of the facade. You see the section. And this was basically our elements. They were casted in a factory, basically delivered on site and assembled. And the assembly was very precise, and it was kind of a very joyful experience, because the building grew so quickly because it was basically built like a piece of Lego. And this was the benefit. Every corner, every line was very sharp, because it basically profited exactly from this process of an industrial factory that could deliver it. And we combined this concrete architecture with a very automotive idea of a window. This is a slider, a new slider which we developed that slides electrically and is being tied with air pressure. And you see this is the system, so it moves. It looks like, it functions like a bus door or something. Every time the bus door is closing, they push air in it, and therefore they make it tight. And with this system we could fit and meet the ecological standards of Switzerland, because normally sliders are no longer really possible. And that what we introduced this system because we thought that since every user, every level has a different user, there will be always these interferences. There will always, at one point, someone opening a window and someone not, and so on. These time lags actually produce a kind of distortion of this facade that has its own game, a very simple moment. You see it, a few are open, then the others are closed, and so on. So there is a kind of irritation, and we were interested in this, that this mirrors, in a way, the different applications of space that were conceived. And you see how calmly this building sits in a kind of very heterogenic condition, so very rigid, that produces this possibility of, although being rigid, very playful, that you can also be very playful with it. Some side view of the thin side of the slab, and then the landscape that were introduced. And this was basically the appearance of the building when we concluded the first set of commissions. That was basically to do the core and the shell. And then, because we could still operate well with the client, we in a way prepared an architecture that an interior designer could come and another designer. This would be the reality. And we were very lucky because we could test actually our interior, so to speak, ourselves, because they went on to commission us, and this was office. And now you see how an office is coexisting with a palliative. You know what palliative is? This is a care, medical care, where people die. And and then this was the business hotel. So you had a business hotel, a palliative, an office. All these were always integrated in this core and shell system of the spaces, and a few images in the daycare. And every time you see these rigid concrete that are completely different, exploited, different used, different interpreted, so to speak, from the user, so in terms of the kids or in terms of the medical care area. where the adjacent material, the built-in, so to speak, would never cover the work of concrete, but would always only add the work of concrete. So there's absolutely no covering in the entire building. So the building is very authentic. So the partition walls are in wood, the facade are in concrete, ceiling, of course, is in concrete. So you see this system, how it works. The business hotel, same setup, but a different texture, a different usage of textiles. This later we built our own office in it. So this is our office. So you can also use this as an architectural office. It's as if we would test that a conference center, a daily restaurant, public restaurant, etc., etc. So there was like an applicable set of rules, and in this you could basically vary very intensively the idea of the users. And in the end, it's a kind of a very colorful time lag, and although the building is very rigid, it's very urban, it's very diverse, it's activated with all kinds of different programs in it. And more or less at the same time, we had this project as well. And it was a high-rise tower in London. And we worked in a way in the same premise, and I think it's a very good example to just show how close you could eventually also work with this idea of housing, because housing is still one of these programs that ask for like a total design, you know, like a preconceived model of life. This is also the tradition of the modernity. To make a plan, to make a floor plan, so to speak, with rooms, etc. And we exploited basically this condition and wanted to question the role of central nucleus and the periphery that would always be the same. And we used different cores, actually, engaged the platform, and in between, what you get is a kind of, you get a residue, basically. You get a platform that is no longer defined, and what we liked about this scheme is that there is a system of control and tolerance at the same time. So something which we are very picky, something very really precise in terms of making, and that's what you see in the plan. So these cores were completely calibrated and worked out and optimized. And the space in between was just free for occupation, free for different models of life. And you see this, you could occupy that fundamentally different and still operate in your own system. So you see the similarities to the previous project. So it was a kind of a base idea that could enhance or provoke different occupancies inside. You see how straightforward the building is. All the bathrooms, of course, are on top of each other. All the kitchens are on top of each other. And this is how we imagined the building, basically a semi-raw, refined condition. So you could actually live in this ambiguity, or you could also, of course, fill it completely up. Some other impressions. And then on every level, a different life, or on every level, a different idea of housing. And this is, in a way, if you imagine that you, through the fact that you introduce this to your system, you start to make things possible rather than the aspiration to design everything. And in the end, it's almost impossible that someone with a different aspiration is meeting this space. This is how it sits in the context, a bit more axonometrically seen. You see the opening of the kitchen with the balconies adjacent to it. This is another project, and is a portrait. Actually, this is my brother, and this is my teacher. Yeah, and this is for us a very bizarre experience, because we were invited by the German Werkbund, and if you recall Werkbund, there's in 1920 they designed together with Mies and Corbusier and out the Werkbundsiedlung in Stuttgart, and 100 years later, the German Werkbund wanted to redesign or wanted to initialize this idea of making a quarter, a city quarter, no longer an idea about Siedlung, but to actually operate in the city center, and to develop prototypes of houses that would increase the debate, the discussion, how the brutal housing shortage in Europe's main cities could be dealt with. At the same time, also, what would you do? And the unique condition is that you were asked to work with 44 colleagues. So it's not your client and your architect and the client pays you, but there are 44 colleagues that have to agree about the plan, have to agree about the master plan. So we found that very interesting because this was like working with different generations. So our teacher basically was also part of the team, but also some younger colleagues that actually started to study with us were in the team. So it was all across. I never experienced that as an experiment. And it was so harsh and so difficult to establish that every architect had to sign the master plan. Every architect had to agree about it by his signature. And this was the master plan. You could not send plans around. You had to sketch it in situ together with them so that everyone agreed about it. This was the black plan, and this is this quarter in Charlottenburg in Berlin, next to the Spree, down in the south. You see the Spree, the river of Berlin. And it was maybe not such a courageous plan, but for us, the procedure, of course, was very courageous. And this was the site plan, and then there was a drawing, like a lottery, basically, and we drew this lot here, which was very unspectacular and very simple, or it was over the corner. It was not a high-rise, and it was not something but this was all okay, because the question, which was much more interesting, what would you propose as a type of house, as a type of apartment, in this idea of the Werkbund to allow a kind of a prototypic development of a house that would find answers. That's the image of the site plan. And this is what we proposed. We proposed a very rigorous grid again, and we made our analysis through the development of the modern apartments. And what was very interesting is that the modern apartment was always linked to the minimal. The development of the modern apartments were linked to a minimal size of the living room, the minimal size for a parents, the minimal size of a kid, etc. Everything was, and this was the beginning of a hierarchy, basically, of the spaces between a small children room or a larger living room, etc., etc. And what we did an operation that is kind of exactly in the other way. We blew up the minimal and used an 18 square meter square space, which was just a bit too big, so to speak, just to cover a minimal aspect of usage, and arranged it into this building so that basically kind of a mixed possible occupancy could happen. So we were not necessarily interested that with the two cores that the apartments would have a typecast, and then we would repeat it, but every apartment you could use on your own. Of course, you fix the bathrooms and you fix the kitchens, but the consequence is that you create spaces that relate to each other, which is rather a kind of a Baroque expression of enfilade, which you can close, which you can use as a sleeping room, or you can use as many sleeping room, or you can all live together only in the kitchen, etc. So it doesn't matter anymore if you have 3 kids or 1 kid or none, or you play the piano. And this kind of mixing, we found much more provocative to talk about the mixing in the city and the kind of coexistence of different audiences and different people living in one house, because the reality today is exactly the opposite. The developers or the authors today of projects, they search for a kind of a typecast, and they're all more or less the same, and they have all the same bank account, and this we found much more promising. You see also the distances from one house to another, the street proportions. So it was a very dense quarter at the time. Always remind me to this Spanish Eixample, which are very dense and very tight, but as a reference for this quarter. Public buildings is a very important issue for us, because with the public you always are exposed to questions about education. You're always exposed about how a school or how a university should be conceptualized. And this is a project that is now under construction and is a very delicate site. This is on the left is a listed building from the modernity, and then from on the right side there is a kind of national style from the 19th century. In the middle, we proposed to do an extension, and some other side images. There's a very flat volume that we integrated so not to interfere vertically with the listed buildings. And we developed the concept to combine a gym hall, a triple gym hall, with a school. And what is interesting about this is if you combine this, the one creates obligations for the other. And this is a very basic architectural dependency, but you can exploit this as an architectural regime or as a possibility. And we were very interested in this. So you see basically down below the hall, and it had to be spanned over. You see the plan of a triple hall, and on top of it we had to span basically the roof 9 meters in clear height. You see the span directions of four axes. And then in the south you see the foot, main entry, classroom, main entry, teacher area, library areas. And then if you go up, you are in this one level of classroom that then takes maximum profit of a type of space that's too deep. And how do you react to this depth? We rotated the classrooms, because normally they are always with the long side of the facade. And here, with the 90 degrees, we had the short side, so we need to introduce light into this system. And here you see basically the entire simulation of the model. You see down here is the structural device. This is spanning basically the hall, and this is the school that is taking place on one level. And then on top of it is a kind of a very sophisticated exploration about how can you introduce light. And this was the model. It's a kind of a shed pitch combination. You see there's a two-way light introduction, and one is introducing light to the classroom, and the other one is introducing the light to the aisle. And you see this from the other side. So this is the classroom skylight, and this is the lighting system that works for the aisle. And in section, you see how the pivot or the pitch roof pivots now. This is the closed section, and you see how the pitch roof now alters in order to introduce the light in the aisle. And then in the other way to introduce the light to the classroom. And it produces this affinity to the context of lots of pitch buildings, pitch roof buildings around. And it kind of creates this unique level of classrooms that are more like an atelier, basically. This is the view on the aisle, where you see that other system that coexists or introduces the light to the aisle. The sections, how these dense packages are working now together. This is the gym room. This is the structural level here. and this is the classroom. So it's a very, very interesting, very simple configuration of just a hypothesis to combine two things that normally don't fit so well because they have different demands, different depths, different dimensions, and the one and the other is basically normally not working. This is a project that we have recently won in Berlin, and for us it's very, I'm sometimes really surprised because every time we study on our own or elaborate our own methodologies, the next step is always taking abroad, you know, so we always have the possibility to use it abroad, not in Switzerland. It's kind of irritating, but it's like a faith, or it's just where you win your competition, you cannot really program or you cannot really secure that. But this was also a competition about a very delicate ensemble. This is called the Bikini Ensemble in West Berlin. This is the Bahnhof Zoo, so it's a very, very dominated area from the Berlin age where Berlin was divided. It was the most important station of West Berlin, and the Bikini Ensemble was the building that was built after the war, post-war 54 to 58, they built this. And it's called Bikini because they invented the bikini effectively there. So it was not an office building, but it was actually a building that was linked to a textile industry. And in the 58, very interesting, they had to invent something, and they invented the bikini. But they invented many other things as well, especially an empty level. I haven't seen that in my life. This is a building that has an empty level. And this is where they tested it. They could walk outside. So it was a kind of early special type of a house. Of course, this house is totally listed and protected today, and sort of reminds us how compact West Berlin at the time was. This was then adjacent to a cinema area, and this was the entire ensemble. You see the two black areas. This was the so-called Hutmacher house. This means like this is the house where they used to do the hats. And this is the Bikini, which is today the 25-hour hotel. This is the Eurocenter, which was the first building close to 100 meters. And in the center is the Gedächtniskirche, which is a world-class masterpiece from Egon Eiermann, which is this ruin church that he accomplished as a monument in the center. So very delicate. You see the historic images, how it was developed. This was the Eurocenter, the first Bikini, then the Hutmacher here. So the modernity spanned the spaces and did not group it like the postmodern condition. You will see the difference. And this is the building today. It's quite a shame, we found, because it was repaired with a wrong facade, and the building has lost its structural ability, and in December 2020 the entire building has to be evacuated. And it cannot be saved anymore. So what we proposed in the competition basically was to reintroduce another Bikini level. So because this was so prominent, to say like we want to go on with this culture of an empty level that is basically to be squatted, to be explored as an urban level. So there was a kind of a very open ground level, and there was this specific introduction of this empty level. You see this into Kantstraße is a very prominent vista. You see the high-rises of the postmodern area, which act more as a framed view, as a kind of a gate. And then behind the masterpiece of Egon Eiermann, and this is the new slab building with this introduction of this slit, this condition. You see the plan. This is the building. And this is the view, same view from the same perspective now. In the foreground, you see here Bahnhof Zoo, very prominent movie also in Germany. And then here our building with this introduction of public level on 40 meters over ground. And then you see framed the Gedächtniskirche von Egon Eiermann. And the structure was, of course, a kind of a major indication how to do such, and where actually also to do this special level. And what we introduced two X columns exactly in this level. And what was very interesting was that the column on the periphery or on the perimeter, they always collect half of the forces than the one that is in the middle. And by changing those flows, the light one actually gets associated with the heavy load, and vice versa. We end up in a very slender, symmetrical condition in the foot. Yeah? So by changing those flows, actually, it becomes an economical reason. Instead of you have a very high load condition on the facade, very low load on the facade, and a super high load in the mid-fleet. So it was a strategy to express that, but also with a kind of idea of economy, and this was then the image creating exactly this interest. And now remember what I said about strategic architecture. What is interest? What is our interest? Where is it really important? It wasn't so important how this is going to happen, because it will be anyway expensive offices, but it was very important to really think about this space and to think about this way. So you built in the end maybe a 90-meter high rise, but actually 2 levels are the most important, and the others you can hardly influence, and you just let it happen. So it's the same issue about being ambitious and less. This was the long section, which you see this incision, the structural model from the side that sort of quite made clear how this inner space or this incision could be steered. And then the further elaboration of the section. And then the ground level that sort of could have this reference to the original building, to build up a very slender, elegant table, to let basically this ground level to express it in a very porous way, so that you can walk through, that it's public in terms of access. And also here the image that takes even some of the historic materials back into one collage, so to speak, to express why and how we imagine this slenderness, the addressing of the high-rise to the Hardenbergstraße, main address underneath the building with these pixelated, rounded image windows on the side. That is a quote from Wim Wenders, this kind of the sky over Berlin, basically. So this view on the Siegessäule, which is very monumental, multiplied all over the building, basically. And then this space in between, this interchanging platform where you can go and either go to a restaurant or just have a pause or stay on the outside. And you see how we try to do the glass. The glass is going to be contourless, so there is not the corner, because we don't want to have sharp edges, because we want to keep the transparency in this system. You see this incision, this huge terrace, so to speak, to the Zoo, which is the Tiergarten, which is the public park in Berlin. This interchange of the 2 forces coming exactly at this point together, making this specificity of the space, using this terrace as a unique expression of this building, as an idea of iconic, so to speak, without making shapes or something, but just by a very disciplined intervention. And we found this very interesting quote by Sugimoto that said, like, the only way to prove an iconic building is to test it into the blur. Yeah? So we tried to do this Sugimoto image, so to say, like, this should be the recognition, so to speak, of this building. Now this has, of course, a history. And that's why I'm saying, like, we have an affinity to Berlin. Meanwhile, we have an office in Berlin as well. So we're commuting basically between Zurich and Berlin. And this was a very important building that was last fall, more or less a year ago, we finished. And it was a project that is right across a project by John Haydock, which is of course a must to mention in this school, which was a project at the EBA, for the EBA in the 80s. So you have to understand, of course, the context. The EBA in the 80s in Berlin, they were not about concluding the blocks, but they were more about working with fragments. And this is an incredible, impressive housing project with a tower and 2 wings. And exactly opposite is that site along the Friedrichstraße. And if you're in Berlin and if you are able to build on the Friedrichstraße, this is one of the most prominent streets because it is linked to the division, the history of the division of the city. It's linked to Checkpoint Charlie, to all the pain. And the south of the Friedrichstraße is kind of still forgotten today, and the north today is completely over-commercialized. And this was the client, a newspaper, a union. The organization of it is a union, so and a leftish newspaper that started in the 70s as a independent political magazine, and then turned into a kind of daily newspaper. And this is how we visited. It was a huge mess, basically. I could not believe that you could so much pile the simple output of this newspaper agency. And they have been very honest to us, because I have never really experienced this anywhere else, in the sense that they told us that they don't know how to work in the next 10 years, because of all this digitalization and all the new formats and all this. There's a fundamental revolution going on at the moment. And at the same time, they just knew that instead of working in 4 or 5 different buildings, they wanted to come and unify and centralize their activities and actually have an architecture that could enhance the possibility to reinvent the media business. And we cannot reinvent the media business because we also know we're not an oracle or anything else, but what we did is we developed a net, a very intense net, and had the imagination that we can make an architecture that is only dealing with the margin and the edge of this building. So we dealt with maybe 1.5 meters of it and developed a structure that is so performative that you don't need a core. Core, of course, you need to stiff out the building, but this structure stiffs out itself, the building, and therefore you don't have these kind of blockages and so on. So we offered them basically depth and an architecture that is very refined and defined at the edge. And you see the structural model here with these spans, 40-meter cross spans, beam structures. And our imagination were to bring the mess back and then to say, like, what we have done is we just make a frame as good as we can, and we give this back to them, and they can use this like in the sense of their own occupation, as if they squat their own building, so to speak. And you don't influence it anymore, but you just become your own witness, so to speak, how they deal with it. So this was the plan, the hypothesis. They agreed about it, and we started to build and did all these diaphragmas, these kind of massive constructions. The structural engineer became our alter ego, so to speak. We designed the structure because it was the architecture, basically. So architecture and structural engineering worked together on the detail, on the making of the building, the introduction of all the forces, which of course had to be very stiff and had to take all the moments of forces because we had no core. And we casted it, we related it to it. We had this typical plan, and this is how we more or less delivered the building, and this is how they squatted it. So the dogs and the couches and sofas and so. And in the beginning, I was in a way irritated, but this is. And then the longer I'm there, the more I actually like it. Because you see that this system works exactly for the sake for them, and has exactly a very precise definition of where do we influence and where not. This was the main conference center, which is today now occupied and used, and has different cabinets. And the ground level, which we also gave them like this, and which now has become a restaurant, a cantina. And the top, which is basically their reunion area, where all the union members and the union general assemblies are taking place. And the architecture was refined and worked with this offset around the building, around this structure, with a galvanized, very precisely joined profile, so that every of the collaborator had a balcony. And this galvanized material got always this color from the neighborhood, or these reflections from the sun. And it's a perfect example how this then, in a way, integrated into the Friedrichstraße in the landscape of Berlin. So this is the last project I'm going to show. It's also a public building. And this time, at a noble outskirts of Zurich. This was the old premise here. This is the old primary school, and in this town, most of the pupils went nowadays to private schools. And now I'm a kid also in Switzerland. The public school was always the predominant version. It's like we had no idea or no reason actually to go to a private school. And this has fundamentally changed. The wealthier the communities, the more they send their kids to private schools. And though the community had a lot of financial means, they wanted to rethink the role of a secondary degree a public school, and came up with a very interesting new program that had to be organized in this site. The site very beautiful, and we proposed a very compact building, which is this squarish building, which you see here, in order to really minimize the impact in the landscape. And you see this in a model, how it kind of got set and accomplishes, so to speak, the existing building. And then we developed a formal model that shows basically all the corridors. And the corridors are organized all 90 degrees rotated. Every level is 90 degrees rotated. And it creates a cross, so to speak, and it becomes a kind of a structural device. And why did we do this? The original condition at the mainstream school in Switzerland was always that the classrooms, they were always fixed. They were always have an idea of, it's like a modular concept which you array basically. And the only flexibility was always the corridor where you fuse in, or where you used niches to engage special didactic concepts. And in the brief, they were exactly the opposite. They wanted to have a fundamental different role of the classroom, and the classroom was always breathing. The classroom was always changing in size, but they needed to have a very constant corridor. So we reversed this idea. This was the corridor model, and this was then the structure. So you see, this is the corridor. This is then, in consequence, the free span down below is corridor, free span, corridor, and so on. So the corridor became a kind of an instrument to organize large spans in the house. And you see the superimposition in this model that has no slabs in it, so you can see through. It's like an X-ray. You see exactly how these beams and rotations work. It's a very simple operation, so to speak. Every time you set a new level, you rotate it around 90 degrees. And here you see it. These are the beams that then go across, and then here is this way, then here again here, and so this rotation basically allowed us to organize a structural device that would hold and reinforce these large spans where you could place any classroom, have any division, no structural presence. This was the raw building, 14-meter span with this ceiling, and this is the pickup beam that sort of picked up all the forces and loads, and this is the ceiling plan where you see exactly how these pickups are organized along the perimeter here, and then the cross column around that point, basically the plan is rotating. And the benefit is that you could change and vary all these classical classrooms, make ateliers, clusters, different sizes, and engage basically the corridor to enhance these differences of the classrooms. And this is the view into this section that gives access to this rotation of the corridors. And it has a kind of circular stair, and this is the main entry. This is the cafeteria, and this is basically the public level. And then you see the beginning of the staircase here, the occupancy with area where they eat, but they also do their homework. And then the first corridor, and you see how now the corridor rotates. And this produces this regime of corridor and classrooms. Some other images. You see how open the classrooms are on one side. You see how the structure is organized. The smallest classroom, you see these devices here. Smallest classroom was 18 square meters, and the standard is close to 80 square meters, but you could also open them completely up and then have these reunion surfaces again in the corridor area. You see how you could open, or you could even internally change classrooms. And this this configuration made the physical appearance of the building. So the closed area and the corridor and the open span and this repetition of it that gave the building its kind of own logic in appearance and in its presence. And I'm trying to look if this is working. And this is then a travel to see that it kind of produces not only a structural device, but eventually, of course, also a sensuality with materials and relations. And this is what we, in a way, aiming for. You see the corridor. You see how it's very densely, compactly placed in this small campus. How it's stacked with these different spatial protagonists. And then how the lake in the far background starts to play a role. You go in, basically, you see this kind of regime of spiral staircases that connect 90 degrees rotations. So every level has its own orientation, inside as well as outside. Every view to the outside, basically, is kind of different. And you arrive basically in this corridor, and then you see this main entry down to the public level. The transparency of classrooms that start to fuse to the corridor, that start to be changing or in size or adapted. A closed and an open side, and one side was closed, and the other side was completely glassed. And the building basically all done in concrete. So it's again similar to the previous project. What you see is what you get. There's like no cladding or no concept to shape something over it, but it's simply this device. You see now you open all the classrooms and you have these atelier-like extended classroom sizes. The preparation zones that then go into the different sizes of classrooms. Something which is, in a way, natural or self-evident in an office was a big issue, actually, to start to discover the dissolution or the dissolution of the classrooms. And this maybe bridges back when I visit your studio, where all the different years sit together, is basically a very impressive moment. So I thank you for your attention.